These are Britain's drowned villages, communities that were deliberately demolished brick by brick and then flooded to create reservoirs for the nation's growing cities. What happened to places like Derwent, Mardale Green and Capel Celyn reveals one of the most systematic acts of erasure in British history. Between the late 1800s and the 1960s, dozens of entire communities vanished beneath the waters of man-made reservoirs. Here's what most people don't realize about this process. These villages were not simply flooded. They were methodically dismantled, their buildings reduced to rubble, their trees uprooted, and even their graveyards emptied before a single drop of water covered the land. The story begins with Britain's Industrial Revolution. By 1931, Manchester alone housed 751,000 people who all needed water to drink, cook, wash, and work. The existing water supplies couldn't meet this explosive urban growth. Cities like Manchester, Liverpool, and Birmingham turned to the countryside for solutions, and they discovered perfect valleys that could be dammed to create massive reservoirs. Take the village of Derwent in Derbyshire's Peak District. This was not some tiny hamlet. Derwent had stood for centuries, complete with a church, shops, farms, and the Grand Derwent Hall where physician Charles Balgi was born in 1708. He would translate Boccaccio's Decameron, creating what experts considered the finest English translation of its time. The village supported a thriving community, had a rich history, and sheltered generations of families who called it home. But Manchester needed water, and Derwent's Valley offered the perfect solution. In 1935, the Derwent Valley Water Board began compulsory purchases of every building in the village. The residents had no choice. They were forced to sell their homes, their businesses, their entire way of life. What happened next was extraordinary in its thoroughness. Teams of workers systematically dismantled the village piece by piece. Trees were uprooted to prevent them from washing downstream when the flooding began. Buildings were demolished to stop debris from damaging the dam structure. Even barnyard manure was dug up to maintain water quality in the future reservoir. The Church of St. John and St. James held its final service on March 17, 1943. Picture the emotion in that building as generations of families said goodbye to where they had been baptized, married, and buried their loved ones. The stained glass windows were carefully removed and later found a new home in St. Michael and All Angels Church in Hathersage. The church bells were saved and relocated to St. Philip's Church in Chaddesden. But the building itself had to go. By autumn 1943, every structure in Derwent had been reduced to rubble. The only thing left standing was the church spire, preserved as a memorial to what had been lost. At the end of 1944, the waters began to rise, and 464 billion litres of water slowly covered what had once been a living community. The reservoir officially opened on September 25, 1945, when King George VI pulled back a curtain to reveal the commemorative plaque. It was now the largest reservoir in Britain, supplying water to millions. But for more than a year, that lonely church spire rose eerily from the water like a gravestone, marking a drowned civilization. Too many people were swimming out to touch it, risking their lives to connect with what remained. For safety reasons, the spire was finally dynamited on December 15, 1947. The same pattern repeated across Britain. In Mardale Green in the Lake District, the Manchester Corporation received government permission in 1929 to flood one of the most beautiful valleys in England. Alfred Wainwright, the famous fell walker, wrote bitterly about the destruction. He said Mardale was still a noble valley, but that man worked with such clumsy hands. Gone forever were the quiet wooded bays and shingly shores that nature had fashioned so sweetly in the Hawes water of old. How aggressively ugly, he wrote, was the tide mark of the new Hawes water. The final church service in Mardale took place in August 1935, with hundreds gathering to say farewell. The church was then dismantled stone by stone in April 1937, its materials repurposed to build the water takeoff tower of the new reservoir. 97 bodies were disinterred from the churchyard and reburied in Shap. The Royal Engineers used the remaining buildings for demolition practice, testing new explosives on homesteads that had stood for 500 or 600 years. The most controversial drowning was yet to come. In December 1955, the villagers of Capel Celyn in Wales learned about their fate from reading the Liverpool Daily Post. Liverpool Corporation wanted to flood their valley to create Llyn Celyn Reservoir, and they did not need permission from any Welsh authority. An Act of Parliament was enough. The villagers fought back like no community before them. They marched to Liverpool twice in 1956 to voice their objections. When the Try-were-in Reservoir Bill came before Parliament in January 1957, 35 of Wales's 36 MPs opposed it. The 36th abstained. Not a single Welsh representative supported the destruction of this Welsh-speaking community. It did not matter. The bill passed anyway. This democratic deficit sparked something profound in Welsh consciousness. Plaid Cymru's vote share jumped from 0.7% in 1951 to 5.2% in 1959. A year later, Gwynfor Evans won their first parliamentary seat. More militant groups emerged, including Mudiad Amddiffyn Cymru, which bombed a transformer on the dam construction site in February 1963. The opening ceremony in October 1965 lasted less than 3 minutes. Protesters had cut the microphone wires, making speeches inaudible over the chants of hundreds of demonstrators. Alderman Frank Kane of Liverpool Corporation pulled a lever and buried Capel Celyn under 68 million tonnes of water. 12 houses and farms vanished, displacing 48 of the valley's 67 residents. Why was all this demolition necessary? The engineering was precise and unforgiving. Trees and buildings left underwater would eventually rot and surface, potentially damaging dam structures or contaminating water supplies. Cellars were filled in, privies disinfected, and every trace of human habitation removed to ensure the water remained pure for the cities that would depend on it. Consider the meticulous planning involved. A 17th century pack horse bridge in Derwent had a preservation order preventing its demolition. Engineers dismantled it stone by stone and rebuilt it at the head of Howden Reservoir in 1959, where it still stands today. This level of care extended to relocating not just structures, but memories. Church stones became parts of new buildings, bells rang in different towers, and memorial chapels were constructed using salvaged materials. The irony is striking. These reservoirs, built to serve Britain's industrial might, also became training grounds for one of the country's most famous military operations. In 1943, the newly created Lady Bower Reservoir was used by 617 Squadron to practice for the Dam Busters raid. The dam's towers closely resembled those on the Möhne and Eder dams in Germany, making it perfect for rehearsing Barnes-Wallis's bouncing bomb technique. Maurice Cottrell, whose family once lived in Derwent, captures the profound loss. He says, "People come up to me and say how beautiful it is around here, but it is nothing like it used to be. It is all man-made now." Kathleen Greenan from the Bamford History Group reflects on the human cost. She says, "The last church service must have been incredibly sad. Those villagers gave up an entire way of life. Most were rehoused in an estate, and it must have been such a change. They were used to being completely self-sufficient." Today, these drowned villages occasionally resurface during severe droughts, as they did in 1976, 2003, 2018, and most recently in 2025. When the waters recede, the ghosts of foundations, walls, and stone steps emerge like ancient ruins. Thousands flock to see these remnants, walking among the bones of communities that were sacrificed for the greater good of urban Britain. In 2005, Liverpool City Council finally issued a formal apology for Try-were-in, acknowledging the hurt of 40 years ago and apologising for any insensitivity by our predecessor council. Some welcomed the gesture, others called it a useless political gesture, 40 years too late. The dismantling of Britain's drowned villages represents more than just engineering pragmatism. It reveals how entire communities could be erased through bureaucratic process, how democratic opposition could be overruled by urban necessity, and how the cost of progress was often paid by those with the least power to resist. These villages did not just disappear overnight, they were systematically destroyed, brick by brick, grave by grave, memory by memory. The water that flows from our taps today carries with it the stories of these lost places and the people who called them home.